Welcome students to the online NPTEL course Contemporary Architecture and Design. In the previous class we talked about the movement, the postmodern movement which started around 1980s onwards, which is after modernism. So in the postmodern movement we showed how it opposed the modernist architectural architectural vocabulary with the example of architectural examples. Now we will also see that how postmodernism, the same concept of postmodernism, percolated in the other creative domain like industrial design and art. So we will see the same principles which was opposing the modernist movement like minimalism and internationalist approach, how postmodernist movement in design and art was also quite similar to architectural movement, and that was opposing the thought of modernist principle. So the design features of postmodern movement was definitely it was started in the late 19th century, 1980s onwards around. So some of the examples were can also be a little before that, and then mostly it is 1980s onwards the postmodernist movement were there. And we also discussed the context why this postmodernist movement was so different from the modernist movement, though in totality modernist movement and postmodernist movement together is the contemporary movement. There are a lot of similarity. The similarities we discussed when we started discussing modernist movement, which was like they were more abstract, and the construction technique is different, and they're very different from the kind of architecture and design was there in the pre-industrial revolution. And we discussed that, but in totality this is contemporary movement, but postmodern also is quite different from modernist movement because of the socio-cultural context was different. In the modernist movement there was colonialization was started in the after 1920s, just after industrial revolution, and then there were two consecutive world wars, so social structure was different, and during postmodernist movement the social structure and economic structure was different. That's why the architectural movement and the way people are looking at in towards architecture was quite different from modernist movement. So other features are the movement against purity, simplicity and minimalist approach. So we discussed that Mies van der Rohe said in the internationalist movement that less is more, and that approach was towards the minimalist approach, and in the internationalist movement we have seen the minimal form, the basic pure form, and with the minimal clean design it was there. But in postmodern design, postmodernity, we will see a lot of emphasis on the aesthetics, and a lot of different kind of elements will be there. Curvilinearity will be mixed with rectilinearity, and different the color palette will be much more than just pure black, white and gray and the pure the primary colors. It's much more, and they explored more color palette, and they included more textures into the texture palette, and it was not simplistic. And we will see that in one of the postmodernist architect, Robert Venturi said less is more, which is absolutely opposite to the minimalist approach of less is more. So for him the lesser element is boring, so that's why the postmodernist architect and designer added more element into the design. So the design, the more elements were in the that was the genesis of the complexity of shape, form and the color and the texture. So all design, all the elements of design was more complex into the one in design as well as in architecture. So contextual correlation, we have seen that contextual correlation was not there in the internationalist movement. So one kind of particular style has to be established in each and every context, and that can be that can be amalgamated within the any context. So that was there in Farnsworth House, that was there in the Johnson House, we have seen in the internationalist movement. Though in the organic movement the approach was different, but organic movement was a phase one movement movement of modernist movement. And phase 1 there were diversity and different approach was there, but when we were going towards the phase 2 and phase 3, if we see from internationalist movement and then monolithic style and other styles which did not talk about the context. So in postmodern, we will see that many of the design and architect they started talking about the context. And then there were critical regionalist approach, which we will discuss, and which emerged from the regions, and architecture was imbibed into the regions. Elements were imbibed into the design. We have seen some examples in the brutalist movement, and some of the late modern movement was also there, which started imbibing the concept of depicting the contextual element into the architecture, but that was in the later phase of modernism again, and that time it translated into the postmodern. But the high modern, the actual modern, this internationalist movement did not talk about the context. Now, meta design, inductive design approach, and co-design process are the process which we talked about it in industrial design when George Nelson was talking about in incorporating voice of customer and incorporating users' opinion into the design, but that did not happen in architecture, and mostly it was architect's own vision and principle, and that was there in the final design. And in postmodern design, we will see that voice of customer, people's opinion was more important, and modularity was more and more emphasized. We have seen the starting of modularity in metabolism, but that was at the end, and that continued in the postmodern era. And also the placemaking and involving thinking about the people's activity in space, which translate the space into a place and identifiable space. That is also there in the, that is also very much emphasized into the postmodern concept. So postmodernist as well as the modernist approach continued in product and interior design simultaneously in today's time, because when right now we are in post after 1980s, the postmodernist movement started, and but the thoughts which was generated in the modernist approach was also there, and many of the architects also follow the modernist approach today in the today's time. So this modernist approach, what started from the 1920s, did not die completely, and all these movements which emerged from the modernism was also there. So postmodernism, there's new movements started emerging in the postmodern era, but modernist movements, we also see modernist architectural examples around us in today's time as well. So it is not just a complete cutoff of the modernist movement and an absolute revolution against the modernity came. It's not like that. So modernism also continued, and then the new era, new thought process of postmodernism also evolved. So we see a mixture of modernity and postmodern approach in today's time. Now, with the example of design, industrial design and art, we will see the same concepts which we have discussed in the previous class. With the examples of architecture, we will see how that was also there in the industrial design and art. So we have discussed about the pure form and pure geometry with example of internationalist architecture style, and complexity with the examples of Wall House 2 of John Hedgedack and the Bilbao Guggenheim Museum by Frank Gehry. Now, if we look at this, you remember that we discussed Broadway Boogie Woogie by Piet Mondrian, which was the Day Stichel movement, and Le Corbusier's chair, which is absolute rectangle, pure material, and the color, the achromatic color black was used. And here you can see the primary colors, which is red, blue, and yellow is used, and it's absolutely rectangular design, and only squares and rectangles are there in the composition. Now if you look at this composition, so this is a modernist chair and this is a postmodernist chair. So if you look at the chair, this chair, if you look at this modernist chair, this does not have any historical context. It is absolute geometric and very less color is there, and pure material was exposed, and then the color of this is black. Now if you look at, there are many colors which is not the primary color, secondary, tertiary, every color is there. So this is orange as a secondary color, then this many different colors are there in one particular design. Now if you look at this material, the material is also colored in different way. So it's not you will not see the material's own texture, and different kind of colors were used on the material as well. So material is also hidden, so true texture of the material is not shown. This is wood carving, and but if you look at also the form is not non-geometric at all, absolutely, and it also has a historic connotation. So it so if you look at this chair, this looks like a classical chair, but if you look at the color, the color is very jazzy, which is related to the contemporary postmodern pop movement, which we will discuss later. But the color is different, which is contemporary, and the shape is inspired from classical, which is not exactly classical, which is inspired from classical. So there is a historic depiction is there, the complexity of color is there, the true material is not shown, and different kind of color which is more which is not just primary color is used. Now this chair is designed by Alessandro Mendini, and he's part of the Memphis Milano design movement group, which we will discuss when we discuss this particular design movement. And but you can understand the difference between the modernist chair and modernist design versus the postmodernist chair. Now again, with another example of poster design, we have discussed about the Bauhaus poster by Herbert Baer. So this is the Bauhaus color, which depicts the Bauhaus design concept, and the pure shapes which are there, and the pure colors are there. And if you look at the font, this is also blend, and this came from pure geometric shapes. Now if you look at this in this side, the Roy Lichtenstein's graphic novel, and you can see these kind of graphic novels are there in different kind of comics books, like Marvel comics and other kind of books. So this has a black border and different kind of curvilinear lines, and different colors are there, which are secondary colors. And if you look at the fonts, these are tilted, and then looks like a sketchy fonts, like it's scribbled using pen. And also the color, this is a part of the pop art movement again. So we'll discuss the pop art movement, but you can see the differences between the color selection and the line quality. So if you look at the lines are also varying in their width, and there are different kind of curvilinear lines are there. And this is a complex kind of posters which comes within the pop art movement. Now if we look at again with the examples of different kind of colors, so Jerry Rietveld, this is Rietveld chair we have discussed in the Eclecticism movement, again with the just different kind of different cuboids are creating all these furnitures. But if you look at these side, there Philip Stark's interior design and Karim Rashid's interior design, a lot of different colors and different type of furnitures, and eclectic mixture of different furniture. So if you look at this furniture, which has a historic depiction, but definitely not purely historic. And if you look at this, this is again kind of geometric, and then there are a lot of different kind of ornamentation, again a woodwork. So it's a juxtaposition of different kind of elements. And if you look at this chandelier, it is inspired from history, but this focus light looks contemporary. So this is eclecticism is also there, which we were talking about in the previous class. So taking inspiration from different kind of visual style and mixing them and making a collage of different sort of design idea. But together, if you look at the design, it looks holistically complete because of the color palette, which is yellow, and achromatic color is dominating, but the shapes are very different. So if you look at this gray and this tint, and yellow and this gold is all over in this design. So this chair might be absolutely different than these chairs, but and these curtains and this kind of design of the chandelier, but and also in the poster you can see the yellow color is also there, so that is creating the harmony. But otherwise there's a lot of different elements are creating this interior space, which was not there in modernist movement. So as in Karim Rashid's design, this is a lot of curvilinear lines are coming in the floor, on the wall, on the roof, and even in the furniture. And if you look at the color palettes, there are a lot of different colors which is creating the interior spaces. And again, the eclecticism also was shown in this design, and also with the example of contemporary art, we will see the eclecticism and how the abstraction and eclecticism, the different concept in modernism and postmodernism are there. So this is a Kandinsky's painting, where we have seen there's no, the painting does not convey any meaning. So it's just the eye movement. So we discussed the Gutenberg's principle and how the eye are getting captured in the first quadrant, and then it revolves in the composition, and that is just this is just a composition with pure shapes and different colors, and does not convey any particular meaning. And so as in the marshmallow chair, this is one just one chair or the sofa is translated into a abstract geometric form. So the sofa's form, which earlier in the pre-modern era was supposed to have a armrest and the backrest and then all the elements, these all elements are translated into a pure geometric elements, which are just combination of circles, and then the backrest, and everything is just a steel rod. This is the eye clock by George Nelson, and we have discussed the George Nelson's impact in the internationalist and late modern movement in furniture design. So if you look at this eye is also, this gives a abstract form of an eye. So the human eye is just translated into the two bilaterally symmetrical lines, and then a pure circle, and one of this hand of this clock is triangle, and another is just rectangle, with which is a composition of pure geometry. And the eyelash are this lines are giving the metaphorical representation of eyelash, and that's it, and that is how the eye clock is constructed. But this is taking example, and in the mood board, in the design board, there's only one thing, which is eye. This is just depicting human eye in a geometric abstraction. But in the other side, if we look at some work of a postmodern artist and visual communication designer. So this is animation by Nina Paley, which is called Sita Sings the Blues. So this is different approach of showing Ramayana in a contemporary world. So I'll not talk about the content of this story, which is also quite different. This is the Ramayana from Sita's point of view. But if you look at the visual designs, so these all are the screenshot from a single animated film. So if you look at, so in the first screenshot, if you can see the Chayanataka from Andhra, the southern part of India. So there's a shadow puppetry was the inspiration of this particular character design. So this shadow puppets of Andhra is designed from the leather and 2D leather puppets, and which has joints over here, and this is a puppet show which happens behind the curtain. So you see the shadow of a blackish color is there. So that kind of color is used, and similar kind of shadow puppetry is used, and the movement of this character is also like shadow puppetry. So you can see this from the YouTube, which is available. And also behind this you can see the calendar art, which is postmodern pop art of this Indian god and goddesses are there. So this is just taken as a calendar word, and these two, this is a postmodern calendar art, which is very realistic, and another is a vernacular art which is in the same frame. And then we can see all these icons who are also juxtaposed with the same kind of visual. So the visual emphasis is visual, the mood in the mood board, and the visual in the visual inspiration is taken from different visual style. One is vernacular, one is pop, calendar art, and another is icons. So everything is taken together. But this is also, it's not just only one, and this is the another kind of another visual style which is there in the same animated movie, which is very contemporary, and digital art is there, so flat color and everything is there. Now another style is also used in the same animated movie, which is inspired from the Rajasthani and Mughal miniature painting, and another visual style which is also very contemporary. So together this becomes a quiche style of design. So this is also a quiche style of painting by Nilofer Suleiman. So if you look at this painting, so again the calendar art will be seen, and then these kind of realistic characters. This calendar art is actually the poster which is behind this human figure. But if you look at the human figure, they also look very different from this calendar art. And then there's another poster which is also very different, and this is more figurative than the actual human being. So this kind of the same painting has different style, and this is called quiche painting, and we'll discuss the quiche style when we talk about the postmodern art movement in this course. Now in the internationalist approach, where a particular design can be fit for any context. So this is Barcelona chair by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, and this does not have any particular contextual depiction of a particular region. So it's not a region specific design, it's a design which can be which is international, which can be which can be there in the any across the boundary. And here this is a contextual design which is part of critical regionalism. What is critical regionalism? We'll talk about that in detail, but that takes inspiration from the surrounding, the local context, and that local context will be imbibed in the design. So if you look at this bed designed by Kenneth Covenpuk, who's a designer from Philippines. So he have taken the inspiration of Philippines local and vernacular architecture and design, and have designed this bed, and which communicates the visual language of Philippines' own vernacular design. So if you look at the material, it is cane, and if you look at on top of the headrest of this bed, this element which gives the sense of a pagoda, which is a Buddhist pagoda or the Buddhist monastery, which also depicts the Far Eastern Philippines architecture and design. And if you look at this chandelier, which is inspired from this red chandelier which we see in the Far Eastern countries, but the shape of this chandeliers are changed. It's not that what we see in the this kind of chandelier. So this has a different shape, but this has a different shape, but the color is similar. But and also the series of chandeliers are there, and which is also placed as a with the bed, and also within the bed, and all this structure gives a sensation of the Philippines' own vernacular design. So there's a contrast between the modernist approach of furniture design and the postmodernist approach of furniture design. Now in the next class we will start discussing each and every postmodernist movement from architecture as well as from the design in details.